Well, good afternoon. The previous podcast may have seemed a little bit off, but it's this almost kismet connection between these classes and why I started taking these classes and how it all connects. And more importantly, how it all connects to a greater whole. And in this case, the greater whole is a translation of these teachings. So what I was getting at is, I was going to ask, I apologize, start over. So this past Sunday was the last class in a series, 12 classes on the Mahadevi, the Devi Mahatmya, more specifically. It's a treatise on the goddess, but it really is essentially about not self, what is awareness, the nature of reality. So it's no different from Yogacara, from Buddhism, from a lot of these paths. And why I mention that is because the teacher he's a doctor a couple of times over, I believe, expert in Sanskrit and the translation of these texts. I forgot what I was getting at on that. It's a 12th class. It doesn't matter. But I was going to ask him about his experience in Germany because he did his second. I think he got his master's at the Sanskrit University in Nepal and then did a PhD in Germany, but he may have done a second PhD, but don't quote me on this. It doesn't matter. So his PhD had to do with translating Sanskrit, translating these ideas. And so I was going to ask him about his experience in Germany because of how many individuals that were inspired by the Indian philosophy, the subcontinent, and all of its different forms that it may take: Buddhism, Hinduism, Vedanta, Shaivism, Advaita of all sorts. But like I said in that previous, he answered the question already, because he said, well, none of these modern movements or gurus or traditions or lineages have at their root the Vedas. So that's why they're, fly by night, they come and go, and maybe also why they are missing the sufficiency that these people are looking for in these practices, because they don't have. And I understand what he's getting at. It's not just the tradition, meaning, we're older than you, but it has to do with this universal tradition that it's been worked on. And he even said that, they've been working on this for centuries, so it has more gravitas, it has more weight, more value, more oomph, more respect, all the above. But as I said, I changed my question then for the final day, but it didn't get asked because I don't know the thinking behind the students, his students that choose who they're going to ask, because again, they end up asking more questions than the rest of the audience combined. So it's three people that are helping out the professor who end up asking, just the three of them end up asking more questions than all of the other students combined. And in last week there was over 100 people in there. So imagine that. Three people are taking up more of the professor's time than the rest of the class. But of course, Acharya probably doesn't realize that that's what they're doing, right? He might think, well, there's only a half dozen questions that come in. But I don't think he realizes that, they are, appropriating some of his time. But the question that I wanted to ask him was originally, like I said, Germany, and what sort of discussion they had. But then, as I said, this evolved into a deeper discussion as to why it isn't commonly discussed. And I also wanted to ask him, so if they miss Nietzsche and Jung, Nishitani and Schopenhauer, and then the greater influence even beyond that, Maslow even recently I found out was influenced by these same teachings. If they're not discussing this in a program, a PhD program, designed to help better translate these, not just the language, but also the meanings, the message, the practices, the ideas, this universal message. If they're not discussing it at that level, why not? Is it because they don't understand? Is it because they don't want to? Do they not want to confuse what's going on? Because I put to him another question. What is his opinion about the idea that we need to take these myths, these archetypes, and modernize them, as was what Nietzsche was doing with Zarathustra? The Übermensch was a modern interpretation of Christos, the anointed one, from Greek, this idea of being the best that you can possibly be. Bodhisattva, right? Shakti, this universal connecting power, influenced Jung to develop this idea of Zella. But Jung and Joseph Campbell and Northrop Frye all said what was important about the Bible is that we understand that these are monomyths, right? The hero's journey. Even for me, Mahakali, these ferocious Buddha aspects, or goddesses that are ferocious, it's not the same idea of, the Wicked Witch of the West. It's this complete package of good and ferocious in one, right? And I love what Acharya talked about, is that you may be afraid of a lioness, but if you were one of her cubs, right, would you be afraid? But more importantly, the lioness is ferocious, but would she apply that same ferociousness to her own cubs, right? So you can recognize the ferocity, but not fear it in the same way that you might, especially when this is this God-fearing idea. So it's not fear in the sense of the wrathful will punish me. It's more like a lapdog wants to please its betters. So we're like that as well, in the sense that we're trying to craft ourselves something anew. So really, the goddess is a reflection of our ultimate desire to be better. So really, that reflection is what we're looking for, right? So we're not looking to please, we're looking to see our own reflection as to being, we're doing the job that we're meant to do. So I wanted to ask him, what is his belief, or does he have an opinion on the importance of translating these myths, these archetypes, these messages to a modern audience? I've made jokes about using the Lion King or Pinocchio, and I'm trying to adopt that myself. So I wanted to know his opinion on this. Is this something that he finds important, or is he a little further upstream from this cultural affect? What I mean is he simply looking to translate these documents as perfectly as possible, and allowing them to be maybe Andy Warholized by other people downstream? But that being said, then my question is, what is your opinion about the obfuscation of these same teachings if we don't teach the source of the same? What I mean is, if we don't understand, like with Nietzsche, if we don't understand what it's trying to teach, we might misunderstand that the Übermensch is something that we arguably can achieve ourselves, which no attainment, it's harmful in and of itself. So this moonshot goal, that a goal that we realize we're not going to achieve can motivate us more than a goal that we know is achievable, because we can set, it may sound arbitrary, but it's not. It's, think of it more like a flexible room to land, right? So our landing zone is flexible, expansible, because we have no idea what our potential might be on any given day. As David Goggins says, we usually think we're out of gas and we've only used maybe 40% of our gas tank. But that being said, depending on the day, right, we have more fuel in that tank. So this extensible landing zone allows us to reach further than we would ever give ourselves credit. Because I know myself, I'm coming off a couple of days of being very unwell, so that limits what I can do. In fact, what was it? I was surprised. I was only able to do one short little thing. Oh, yeah, my class on Sunday. So I was only able to be in the class. The stress of being called on for the question, because again, I'm very honored to be in the class, and I don't want to be misunderstood, and I don't want to, you know me, if you've been listening to my podcast, I can ramble. So I was nervous, but I was just tired, right? I was just done even before that day had come about, right? So to me, here's the doubt. There were some questions in there, right? How do you work through doubt? And he answered it very nicely. He said, you work on one thing, right? So I've mentioned this before. You use mantra. You fixate on your mantra. Fixate on your breathing, pranayama. Breathing is an important thing, especially for those that are traumatized. You tend to do short, shallow breaths, which is just exasperating your physical anxiety. So deep diaphragmatic breaths helps pump the lymph system. It's just better for you. Keeps yourself healthy as well. So he said, yeah, doubt, very important. It is as much from the goddess as confidence. He explained the importance of trust. This last class, he mentioned Shraddha, faith, but the idea of commitment, confidence, and devotion, right? So it doesn't negate doubt. It just gives you that trust to proceed within. So I was wondering whether he understood, from my perspective, how important it is. Because I got a short little story for me, how this works. So it wasn't actually Acharya that's reaffirmed my belief and understanding of these teachings. It was for me, I was a soul practitioner, right? I always joked about being a pratyeka Buddha. So this idea of being a soul practitioner and not having a guru per se. Not 100% true, but it is for the most part. But for me, I ended up giving of myself, selfishly looking for just a deepening of my understanding, of my practice, of my devotion, of my commitment, of my confidence. I started giving tours in a different sect, me being a Yogacara and a Chittamatrin Buddhist, Tantric Buddhist. I ended up practicing with Pure Land or Chan affiliated temple. So not the same sect, but similar, very close. As I said, Yogacara. In the Lankavatara Sutra, it is said that the Buddha taught this exact same lesson of Tantric Buddhism in all of Buddhism, but he just taught it in different ways for different audiences. So for me, my wavelength is Tantra. For others, it may be Pure Land, it may be Chan, it may even be Guan Yin, goddess worship. I mean, Guan Yin or Avalokiteshvara is, if nothing else, goddess worship. So all of that's available to you, but you wouldn't believe what actually deepened my resolve and made me understand exactly why I love Yogacara. So I was actually watching the museum all by myself one day, and it's a beautiful stupa, so people can come in, and there's multiple levels. I tended, if they wanted to, and it wasn't mandatory, I could give them a tour if they wanted, or they could just wander fairly freely if they'd like. Most of it was pretty self, there was little plaques and such, so you could go on a self-guided, or I could answer any questions, show you around. I could do just about whatever you'd like. So one day I had a pretty high-end practitioner come in. Don't quote me on this. I believe he was a follower of Krishna. The robes, his japa mala was hidden in a bag. Just all of the examples of what he may have been, this practice he followed. And we ended up talking a little bit. And he asked me what I felt the difference between the two. And of course I thought I was pretty smart. And I said, it's our concept of the Atman, of the soul, is different between his practice and mine. And so essentially his question was just, is it? That was it. No argument, not trying to convince me in any way. And keep in mind, I've been studying Yogacara for decades, even at that point. But that still led me to question and go, well, what is this difference? And that's what led me to understand that Buddhism is not teaching, at least in the West, is not teaching it completely. Because what was missing was this concept of a perfected nature. Right? So I'm going to get into this quickly, and I apologize, but there's an idea in Yogacara of an eighth and a seldom taught ninth consciousness. Some people think the eighth consciousness is strictly Yogacara, but it's not. It's just Yogacara realized how important and foundational it was to understand this eighth consciousness. So you have 1 through 5, your senses, just your run-of-the-mill consciousness. And why they teach it this way is because your eyes see, and then they just tell your next level of consciousness what they see, and that level of consciousness interprets your senses, right, parses the data and passes it on up the chain, right? So 5, 6 parses the senses. Your 7th consciousness is this perception, not of self, but the conglomeration, right? What's the word? Klesha? It doesn't matter. It's a organization. So you recognize that, not you, but this 7th consciousness, recognize the 5 senses, the consciousness that acts as intermediary for those senses, and understands its at least its somatic experience as a whole. That's not where it ends, though, because that's not the concept of self, right? Because this concept of self transcends our physical experience. It even transcends our psychological experience, our mental, our fantasy, any of that. This idea of self seems to transcend. And I'm not talking about, a greater sense being of self. I just mean our own personal sense of self. That's the 8th consciousness. It's called the Laya Vijnana in Sanskrit. And why it's important? Because the Laya Vijnana is something that is what modern science, artificial intelligence, cognitive science, they should all be looking at, which surprises me even more that it's not often discussed. The Alaya Vijnana is a storehouse consciousness. We fill it with these little seeds of self. They're called bija. You fill this storehouse up with previous experience, preference, the identity of self. Like, I'm cool, I'm fit, I'm what have you, whatever, in positive or negative. All of these aspects that were just experience, but you could easily just leave behind and roll on forward, but you don't. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is, as example, I am a follower of Yogacara, Zen Buddhism if you want, And a foundational text to that is this Lankavatara Sutra. It's only been translated a few times in history. What's really interesting, in the last 10 years, it was translated again and kind of brought together all the different translations. But I came across a major mistake, and until I was able to really learn to express myself in a written fashion, and I mean, it literally just would have fallen on deaf ears, because I just would have been, if you've listened to a podcast from a couple of years ago, just the rantings of a raving lunatic it would have sounded like. Rather than explain it very simply here, so he's translating a section of the Lankavatara Sutra where it talks about this progression. I've mentioned it before, Chitta, Vritti, Nirodha. It's a foundational understanding that transcends Buddhism, Vedanta, Advaita, Shaivism. It's all the same teaching, the true nature of self. In fact, Shaivists use the same term for self, upakara, as Vasubandhu, a practitioner of Yogacara, foundational, a patriarch, I guess you would even call him. So the important thing here is Red Pine is the translator, modern translation of the Lankavatara. He has multiple languages to resource from, Chinese, Japanese, I believe, Sanskrit in a couple different forms. There's even English. We got D.T. Suzuki's translation and his guide to the Lanka. Yet in this section, he ignores two of the translations that say 8 consciousnesses need to be, I'm not sure the words he chose, don't quote me on this, but either emptied or eliminated or what have you. The emptiness, there's a lot of flowery language. The idea is needs to be dealt with. Right? The way I explained it to the wife is Chitta, Vritti, Nirodha. Chitta is a consciousness. Vritti is like fluctuation, flapping of a flag. And Nirodha is cessation. So cease the fluctuations of consciousness, of mind, of identity. Right? So same as the first 5 senses, same thing can be done. You only pay attention to the colors and pass that information along. You don't show a preference. You don't attach or have an aversion to. Right? You cease useless flapping. The way I explained it is, if you think of a flag is meant to blow in the wind, and it fills its function by being full. The flag. Form and function. But if you find a flag flapping too much, violently flapping, for example, you'll find that it no longer unfurls fully. A flag no longer has its form and its function because it got too much. This is our goal. So he ignored 2 other translations that said 8 consciousness need to be emptied. And he said, well, they must have meant 7, because he's probably only been taught about the 8 consciousnesses. He hasn't been taught about the 9th. Rare teaching, Yoga Karan most specifically, but it's mandatory. Because if the 8th consciousness is the identity of self, this storehouse of consciousness, well, you're going to need to drain that. Once it's drained, you have nothing. There's an empty aspect. Empty. So what would that make you? You're empty of unnecessary fluctuations. That's what we call the Amala Vijnana. I've mentioned this before in podcasts because it is foundational to Buddhism, but I didn't realize it's foundational to most of these movements that came out of India and have influenced modern understandings. Jung's philosophy is based on this. Nietzsche, Schopenhauer in a lot of ways, Emerson, Whitman. There's a long list, let's be honest. So once you empty that storehouse of all them little seeds, the bija, you have emptied your previous experience of previous identity, but you're at risk of refilling that. So in the meantime, while you're maintaining that empty state, and this is where this language comes from, and it's come down the years to mean empty of everything, but it's not. It's an empty vessel ready for whatever may come its way. AmalaVijnana is this state prior to actual nirvana, right? Nirvana, where you're free from these fetters, when you're still at risk of becoming a self again, this delusional self, but before you've clung or averted from, or turned away from any of these aspects. While you're in this state, as Nietzsche would call it, amor fati, love your fate. When you're in this state, also his eternal recurrence. If you're accepting everything as ordered, good and bad, as imposters both, as Kipling would say, this is the AmalaVijnana, this perfected nature. But you're among the very few to understand translation errors in Red Pine's Lankavatara, because it is, you must empty or control those 8 consciousnesses, right? Chitta, Vritti, Nirodha, to maintain this 9th consciousness of AmalaVijnana, because once you're empty of these fetters, you still have to live within the ephemeral world here, our conventional world, as some of them will call it. So you're still at risk of becoming an individual, becoming an ignorant, deluded person, but you're not free from those risks. So between nirvana and samsara is this perfected nature, this AmalaVijnana. Chitta, Vritti, Nirodha leads you to this place. I said, between ignorance and bliss, between nirvana and samsara, is Nirodha or AmalaSattva. AmalaSattva, this perfect being. Right? So that was my questions, because originally he was talking about what is the true nature of self in the Devi Mahatma, and he said self-aware creativity. Self-aware creativity is how Nietzsche calls it. Man is the evaluator, Schatzen. Schatzen could be considered creativity, because he says meaning is creativity, creativity is valuing, valuing is... So for me, being in a Buddhist temple, a Pure Land Buddhist temple, as a Yogacaran Buddhist, a Western Yogacaran Buddhist in a Chinese Pure Land temple, having a Hare Krishna come in, question Buddhist understanding of the nature of soul, led me to understand the foundational principle of the AmalaVijnana, this perfected nature, which led to me having this trust, this confidence, this devotion, this shraddha for Yogacara, because I realized it had the potential to heal this trauma of mine as well as others. Again, this universal nature of the self. Right? So for me, the circular nature of this, that this all began with my love of Nietzsche and my love of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that led to thought of experiments that just continued to lead me to this point where we're at now. Right? So that was my class on the weekend. Right? I know that was a little bit rambly, and that's what's weird. I actually did kind of, what do you call it? Scripted, yeah. Because I said it was the Q&As for Acharya, right? I had a question about modern philosophies, gurus, cults. He mentioned last week that he finds that's why they're so aimless and they don't last, is because they don't have connections that go back, to the Vedas, because of tradition, because of value, because of sufficiency, right? It actually helps. So I originally had a question. I wanted to know, what sort of discussions were there when he was in school in Germany? Because of so many of these professors, Nietzsche, Jung, Maslow, Nishitani, he wasn't German, you know what I mean, influenced by Nietzsche, who was influenced by these same lessons and teachings, right? So I wanted to ask him about this modernization of this mythos, these archetypes, right? That Jung and Campbell and Fry all talked about, right? What is his opinion on Shakti being reinterpreted as Zella to Jung, or Bodhisattva to the Buddhists, right? Or Ubermensch to Nietzsche, or Christos to the Greeks, this anointed one, right? I also wanted to know this lost teaching. Do we risk the teaching itself if we don't explore these interconnections? Because for me, it deepened my understanding of Yogacara. It didn't make me a Hare Krishna, to be questioned by a Hare Krishna. Taking Shaivism doesn't make me a Shaivist. All it served to do is deepen my understanding of the same, Yogacara. And so I was just going to mention, again, as far as a background, that this began with him mentioning self-aware creativity, which is this individual, which led me to remember, like Nietzsche's Zarathustra, Jung's Liber Novus, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the Lankavatara Sutras, the Dhammapada. I mean, arguably, I see it in the obscure night of the soul. I don't see very much difference. But I wanted to just quickly mention how important this ninth consciousness, not often taught, and how it shows that this knowledge is being lost because we're not teaching it, right? So because you think there's only 8 consciousnesses, you of course are going to assume that's the final consciousness, the 8th, when it's obviously not. How could it be, right? So that's the question we need to understand. What is between ignorance and bliss? Right? What is between samsara and nirvana? This is this amala vijnana, this perfected consciousness. So what our goal is not nirvana, our goal is nirodha, and we want to be the best we can possibly be. So not just bodhisattva, AmalaSattva. You want to be a perfect being, this entire being, right? This gestalt I keep on and on talking about, mind and body complex, which is why I prefer to call myself a Chitta Matra. Chitta Matra being mind matrix, consciousness matrix, which is mind only. That's literally what this philosophy is. Because I don't see myself as a Yogacara, and I don't see myself as anything but an individual striving to have an understanding of the nature of reality and the nature of self. And I feel like Bruce Lee did, that this applying of labels, which is a Zen teaching as well, this applying of labels is if nothing else, very limiting. Right? As recently as crazy wisdom or divine madness, this idea that Jung said that we need to leave reason behind to explore both sense and nonsense. But it's no different than what Nietzsche told us to do. Realize that you are a camel, carrying traditions and expectations from previous generations and others. You need to grow and evolve into a lion that can tear down those aspects that don't aid you in your path forward. To carve for yourself a new path and a new individual, who you are, who you could be, what your guide and your path may be. As Churyi, which Churyi Shi in Chinese could be translated as Master Calm Change. He's a Tian Tai patriarch, but I consider him an early Zen Chan patriarch as well. He said that sentient beings are numberless, as are the doorways to entry to the Dharma of Nirvana. So how could we understand anything less than how important it is to to find a personal path. Thank you. Have a lovely day.